So let me introduce Medea. I think she's one of those people about whom you say she needs very little introduction, but I will give one anyway. Medea is the co-founder of Global Exchange and CODEPINK Women for Peace, and is the author of a 2018 book, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Her previous books include Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the US-Saudi Connection, Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, Don't Be Afraid, Gringo, a Honduran Woman Speaks from the Heart, and she co-authored with Jody Evans, Stop the Next War Now in 2005. So Medea, please go ahead.
Yes, well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful group of speakers so far, and I want to pick up on a couple of things that have been said. I want to look at how the US public has interpreted what happened. And one thing I don't think that the American people understand yet is the depth of destruction that the US has caused. I was listening to a show on CNN the other day, and they had a panel that came to a consensus saying, well, we tried to build things, but the Taliban would come and destroy. We would build bridges and they would blow them up. And, you know, this narrative, we tried to be the good guys, with no discussion about where these tens of thousands of bombs that the US drops landed. Very little discussion since the Taliban took over about the civilian casualties, what Nancy talked about, why there was support for the Taliban because of the cruelty of the US occupation. We did a study at CODEPINK to look at how many bombs were actually dropped in Afghanistan and came to the number of 46 bombs a day, every day for 20 years. So where did those 46 bombs a day land? The American people have no idea. It's interesting that the last bombs that were the ones from the drone attack as the US was leaving, where the US military made up a story, like they make up stories for the last 20 years, that a high-level person was who was about to attack at the airport was blown up with a carload of explosives. And for the rare occasion where the media actually went out and did a thorough investigation, found out that it was indeed a family of 10 with all their children who had piled into the car to greet the father as he came home. This tragedy is something that we barely see, partly because, as Nancy, you said, there is no draft like in the days of Vietnam. Very few Americans are actually have been dying in Afghanistan or even Iraq, but also because the media has done such a miserable job. Most of those airstrikes happen not in the middle of the city like this last drone attack, but it's not that difficult to get out to these different places. And I would really say we have to condemn the media for the horrific job they have done by covering up for the US and the West in all of these years. But I think now the world has seen that America is able now with its military might to only do one thing, and that is destroy. You know, it used to be that the US military would come in and kick down the doors for US corporations to come in. That doesn't even happen anymore. They just have a pure destructive force. And now we see that China comes in and does the rebuilding. It's a very clear dichotomy that the US destroys and China builds, and all the propaganda the US puts out cannot deny that fact. And that hurts America tremendously on the international stage. I think a lot of people can see that America is in a stage of decline, that our economy has become so financialized that we have gutted our military sector except for the manufacturing of weapons of destruction. And the use of economic warfare through these sanctions has really forced other countries to move towards China and look for other sources of not only trade, but other kinds of currency that we will see just growing in the years ahead. there has been some talk about the new openings, and Nancy, Radhika, it's interesting you started out mentioning the Vietnam syndrome. And, you know, for anybody who doesn't know what that is, that was the result of the US defeat in Vietnam and the American people saying, wait a minute, we don't want to get into that kind of war again. And I think we are experiencing something similar right now, which we can call either the 9/11 syndrome or the Afghanistan syndrome, where the American people are scratching their heads and saying, what happened in those last 20 years? But there is a disconnect that is so enormous, and that is between what the American people are thinking, because they lost support for these wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq a long time ago, but now even more so. And you would think that a logical conclusion would be, while we have all these real threats facing us of the climate and the pandemic, et cetera, isn't it time to say that the military should be held accountable? And part of that is to cut the military budget. What is happening in Congress, though, is just the opposite. There is an effort now to increase the military budget even more than the Biden administration had asked for, which was even more than we had during the Trump administration. So on the one hand, you have the American public that has heard Biden himself say that we wasted, and I would say it's a lot worse than wasted, $300 million a day for 20 years on this war in Afghanistan, and yet we don't have the corresponding efforts within Congress to cut the budget. We know that while the many of us in the peace movement tried to stop the US from getting into this war in Afghanistan to begin with, we only had one colleague in Congress who was willing to join us, and that was Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She has put forth a bill to cut the Pentagon budget almost in half by $350 billion, which would still leave the US with by far the largest military budget in the world. How many of the other 434 other members of Congress do you think have joined her in that request? 4, a total of 4. Now there are about 100 Congress people in the Progressive Caucus. Not even, I think there's only one member of the squad in Ilhan Omar who has joined Barbara Lee in that request. So we have still an extremely strong military industrial congressional caucus, despite this devastating fiasco in Afghanistan. We see the profits from the 5 big weapons companies have soared, in fact, some by over 1,000% in these last 20 years. I managed to get inside the shareholder meeting of one of the big 5, and that is General Dynamics, and said to them, if the only way that you can make these obscene profits is by war and destruction and death, don't you think you need a different business model? And the CEO said to me, you are wrong. We pray for peace. We work for peace. We want peace. Just the week before, she had told her shareholders that the dangerous world out there actually gave a good cadence for their product. And what she was talking about, of course, was China. Which means that we as a peace movement have to focus so much on a campaign that many of you were involved in, and we of CODEPINK have of China's Not Our Enemy, to really stop this massive propaganda campaign now to try to justify this enormous Pentagon budget by the need to confront China. The other issue that Ajama brought up of the opening we have, I think is actually a tremendous one, because, you know, Ajama, it's been very hard to build a peace movement in the United States in the last decade, precisely because there is not a draft, precisely because the wars have been going on for 20 years and the media has barely even covered them. And so our strategy in these last years have been, well, okay, we can't get a lot of people out on the streets, but we can support our allies in these other movements that are connected and try to help them make the connections, whether that was the racial justice movement, the Black Lives Matter, the issues around militarization in our communities, the issues around the lack of money for the green jobs or the Medicare for all. And we have become very much a part of these movements, but we haven't seen until now the real lifting up of the issue of the military budget. And in the last couple of weeks, when I have been going to demonstrations, whether they're about affordable housing or Medicare for all, whatever the issue, I hear people saying, if we could spend $300 million a day for 20 years on a fiasco in Afghanistan, we can put that money into supporting people's real needs, into addressing the climate crisis. And so we are there now. And that's why we at CODEPINK have launched this campaign to cut the military budget. We are reaching out to these different movements, labor, environment, the faith-based groups, the racial justice groups, and say, we need to come together. It might not be on the streets, but we need you to be writing open letters to the Biden campaign, to be educating your own constituencies about this. I don't think that we will see a result in our Congress, certainly not this year, while the budget is being voted on very soon. We won't see it in the next year. But I think I would say that about 5 years from now, we will begin to see the fruits of this effort to cut the budget, to invest those resources that have been liberated into the real needs of our community, and to see what would be a nice way to see an end to this empire would be one that doesn't go out in smoke by blowing up a lot of the world with it, but would gradually move from this idea that militarism is the way to relate to the rest of the world to one in which indeed we use diplomacy and cooperation to relate to the rest of the world. Thank you.